Well, can I begin by thanking George for your introduction and by thanking each of you for coming along. I really appreciate it. Thank you. I have to say I was a little bit nervous. That's an understatement. I was really nervous about this lecture tonight. You never know who's going to be in the audience, but also nervous because I'll be speaking in front of all my colleagues. And it happens that the psychology department at Edge Hill University is a really good department. We've got brilliant people, many of whom I think will be giving inaugural lectures at some point in the future. So that puts a bit of pressure on me, I have to say. But seriously, if you know anyone who's thinking of studying psychology in this area, you should really think about coming to Edge Hill. It's a really, really good department. I thought, given that I think there's going to be more inaugurals coming from the psychology department, and given that I was nervous, I asked some some other older colleagues who've been in the game for longer. I asked them for their advice. What's your tips for giving an inaugural lecture? And given that, as I said, there'll be more coming along, I thought it'd be appropriate to start this lecture with the top tips that people gave me for inaugural lectures. And the first thing people said to me was, entertain and be amusing. You may laugh, but as George said, I'm half German. Imagine where I was feeling, and I hated to break it to you. You may laugh, but contrary to popular belief, we do not have ways of making you laugh. The second thing people said to me was, you want to really concentrate on the big picture. You don't want to give a talk that's full of data and little studies and everything. You really want to tell people why you're excited about the topic area. And so there will be some data, there will be some theory, but I'm just going to try and give you the big picture, and hopefully, I won't be going on and on and on, so there will be time for questions and a little bit of a discussion afterwards. The next thing people said was, you want to tell people where you're coming from. Why are you here giving this lecture? And this is something I'm not really touching on in my talk, so I'll just tell you very briefly why I'm here, essentially. And that goes all back to me being a second-year psychology student at Strathclyde University, where I attended a lecture by a professor called John Davis. And he basically gave a lecture based on some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about tonight. He gave a lecture, and I basically went up on addiction, and I went up to him afterwards and said, I disagree with everything you've said. I don't believe a word of it. He made me change my mind. And I think what I've also taken from this experience is that I think universities, we're not teaching the national curriculum. We're not, reciting knowledge from Wikipedia, where you get some sanitized version of, what something is. Knowledge is much more exciting than that. It's contested. And I think that's something that stayed with me. That's, if we can get that across, I think we're doing something, doing something right. The next tip people gave me, for once it's okay to actually say what you believe. I can see all the academics in the room going, oh my God, they didn't say that, did they? I was as shocked as you were, believe me. I was as shocked as you were. Because for you non-academics in the audience, you might not know this, but academia is actually, we need high-level diplomacy skills in academia. We really do. So say you're applying for a grant, and you think Professor Smith's ideas are crap. You think they're useless. You would never write that. You would say, whilst Professor Smith has, published some interesting work, which has, shed light on lots and lots of issues, we can expand on this further by doing this, because Professor Smith might be the reviewer. So you don't really want to upset anyone. Hopefully I can live up to the German reputation for being frank tonight. And then finally people said, let people know what you're currently interested in, how you're developing your research. Okay, so this is what I'm going to be doing. The first half, I'm going to be arguing that dominant explanations of substance use and addiction centering on addiction are unsatisfactory. In the second half, I'm going to try and persuade you that if we think about substance use and addiction from a more social perspective, this might actually hold promise and be a worthwhile endeavor. I'll also give you some exciting examples of ongoing research in the department. Before I begin, let me be very clear that substance use can kill, can be associated with serious problems for both individuals and for society at large. People's health would be better if they didn't consume substances. However, I don't believe that there is necessarily a mechanism for sane and rational people to continuously engage in a behavior that's bad for them. I think it's an inference we make. It's like psychology is full of examples of people drawing wrong inferences. So you might hold the belief that people coming from a small town are all kind and nice people. And you meet someone from a small town and you assume that they're kind and nice. He might be a psychopathic serial killer for all you know, but it's the wrong kind of inference you make. People do silly things all the time. And I don't think necessarily they do so because they're compelled to do them. People have unprotected sex because people look healthy. I don't think there's necessarily a mechanism that explains why people continuously engage in behavior that isn't good for them. The next thing I think we need to think about is that the way in which we conceptualize behaviors, the way in which we think about a behavior has real-life consequences. It's not just an academic, intellectual exercise. So for example, 50 years ago, if there was a child misbehaving at school, what would you do? You would discipline that child. You might cane the child. Today, the very same behavior, which you couldn't differentiate, you would conceptualize it differently, potentially. You might conceptualize it as a medical problem, as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and you would use Ritalin to medicate the very same behavior. Up until 1973, homosexuality was considered by us psychologists as abnormal. We devoted great amount of efforts to curing it, coming up with a cure. So wonderful people that we are, we would do things like aversion therapy. We'd show gay men pictures of naked men, young, handsome men, and then just when they were enjoying, we go and zap them, give them an electric shock. Today we're talking about legalizing marriage. About 40 years ago, about 40 odd years ago, George Miller said that as psychologists, we should be giving knowledge away. We should be giving our discipline away. We've got a lot to contribute to current topics, global warming, terrorism, migration, prejudice, discrimination, education. However, so reflecting on this lecture, I have to say, psychology is more of what in German would be called gesellschaftsbegleitend, which means it accompanies society. We are a reactive discipline. Society has problems, we'll investigate those problems. When the problems go away, we'll turn our attention to other matters. I think, as I said, I think we've got a lot to offer, and I think, as a discipline, we should be a bit more proactive, perhaps in the future. But now let me get on to what you've come to hear about addiction. So when we think about addiction as an explanation, I think the first thing that springs to mind is it tends to characterize behavior that we don't like, that we disapprove of. If someone continuously engages in a behavior that is nice, that we like playing the piano or playing the violin, we'd have a different word. we would use the word dedication. The other thing about addiction as an explanation is that it predominantly focuses on individual level of pharmacological processes. So we talk about treating addicted people, people craving drugs, experiencing withdrawal symptoms. And I think that this mystifies the behavior. So you wouldn't, in all seriousness, be craving to go and buy a handbag. And then when you get to the shop and you find the shop is closed, you wouldn't say you're experiencing withdrawal symptoms. So I think the explanation of addiction essentially medicalizes behavior. We don't use everyday language to describe it, and I think this is very reductionist, and it's a deterministic explanation. We can say, it's the drugs, it's the nicotine, it's the cigarettes. It's not opportunity, it's not economics, education, it's not your family situation, personal circumstances. It's the drugs. And the other thing to bear in mind is with this kind of explanation, it is the best advertisement you could have if you're in the nicotine patch industry. If you're producing nicotine patches, you want people to believe that they're addicted. You want it to be a medical problem. You want it to be something that you need to take medication to cure. Talk about current conceptualizations of addiction. The one thing about it is, as the explanation of addiction is a multifaceted construct. So we've got biological components, we've got social components, we've got psychological components, personality, what have you. And the beautiful thing about the addiction concept is that we've got these overlapping constructs, and we can basically, like in a sweetie shop, we can pick and choose whichever explanation we want to draw on that suits our purpose. So for example, individuals might say, I've got an addictive personality, I take drugs. Society as a whole might blame the substances. But the beautiful thing about all of those explanations is that they essentially absolve us from responsibility for our own behavior. It absolves individuals from responsibility for their drug-taking behavior, but it also absolves society at large from responsibility. I mean, just try this thought experiment. Say you'd identified poverty as the main cause of addiction. Who seriously thinks that suddenly we would dedicate all our resources to curing poverty? And psychology is full of examples whereby people have self-serving explanations. So when the government goes to war in Iraq, they say it's this situation that forced it upon us. When the government raises pensions, they say, look at us, we're wonderful, caring people, we care for the older people in our society. So we take credit for good things and blame others for bad things. So I think addiction is also that kind of functional explanation. It serves important psychological functions within society. It also is, as I was saying earlier, it's a reductionist explanation. The source of the problem is within the individual. You focus on the addictive properties of substances, and you're ignoring the context, the motives for substance use. And we have to accept that for a variety of reasons, some people find substance use enjoyable. But psychologists, and we come from a perspective where that's almost inconceivable. And within the literature, there is a clear dominance of disease and pharmacological explanations. Basically, addiction, drugs, substances have the power to overpower us, and individuals susceptible to addiction, and bring about this disease-like entity where people are compelled to take drugs and need greater and greater quantities of drugs. And this is a quote from the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, who's Leon Trotsky's great-granddaughter. And you might think, Derek, what are you on about? I mean, it's clear to see the drug user's brain is green. I mean, what are you on? What are you on about? But the thing about this is that brains don't actually think in colors. You know, brains and the way we visualize brain activity is that we use a functional fMRI scanning techniques, and they produce lots and lots of complicated numbers, and then we as scientists make a choice. We choose which color we want to give to our results to emphasize whatever point we want to emphasize. There's even a literature, as Tim Hickman from Lancaster University pointed out to me, there's even literature recommending what color schemes fMRI scanners should use. Don't get me wrong, I think there will be differences in brain function between people taking drugs and people not taking drugs. But I think this is a case of, you know, bad science in the name of doing good. You know, you recognize that it's the intention behind this, but it leaves a bad taste to me as a scientist. And the addiction world is full of this kind of thing. So we tell people, if you take cocaine, you know, you're 44 times more likely to die of a heart attack than not. But we don't give the base rate of information. So we don't say, for example, if you look at the, you know, statistics, you know, age range, you know, you're most likely to die of a heart attack when you're like, you know, over 55 or 60 or whatever, and you know, you're most likely to take cocaine when you're young. And in actual fact, the chance of dying of a heart attack are, you know, not whatever percent in when you're young. And so when you take cocaine, yes, your chances will be increased, but this is still relatively unlikely. So I have a problem with sort of using science to do good, really. Similarly, we talk about addiction as an equal opportunities disease. And it's very different if you're, you know, on an estate and have a drug problem, or if you're like in a, you know, a mansion and have a drug problem. I think we need to be a bit more careful. And this is taken from yesterday's Twitter feed from NIDA. To show you, and I think the first thing that springs to mind is that it's a very sort of American, this is the official feed of the funding body. You know, it talks about bringing the power of science to bear on the drug abuse and addiction. It's like reminiscent of the language used in the war on drugs. And I think it really, really matters what they think. Consider this. This funder has got a budget of $1 billion. So just by comparison, the ESRC, which is the Economic and Social Research Council, has a budget of $200 million, and that's for the all social sciences. So, you know, if funders have an agenda and put a lot of money into it, I think it's a problem. I mean, they do fund social research as well, but I think there's a clear agenda here. And you know, the nicotine patch industry will be very much in favor of this agenda. There's problems with this view of addiction, though, this disease-like addiction. One of the bodies of evidence that speaks against this notion of addiction is the finding that over long periods of time, individuals are able to consume substances in a controlled manner. And they can consume very addictive substances such as heroin or cocaine over long periods of time without ever sort of experiencing any of the problems that you might associate with addiction. Don't get me wrong, I'm not advising anyone to go home tonight and shoot up some heroin. I think it's a difficult drug to manage. But the point is, it is possible to manage such addictive drugs, and they do not inevitably lead to loss of control. The second sort of area this is the work of my former PhD supervisor, John Davis, that speaks to problems in the evidence for addiction, is the notion of verbal self-reports. So a typical study might ask, in psychology, we rely on verbal reports. We rely on asking people, and then write down the answers and base our findings on verbal reports. However, John Davis demonstrated that we can't always take what people say to be the truth. So in a typical experiment, what he would do is he would wear a white lab coat, get a drug user into the university in a very formal setting, and ask him or her a series of questions, such as essentially why you take drugs. And in this very formal setting, substance users would essentially give very addicted types of explanations. They say, I take drugs because I'm addicted to them. I have no control. I'm compelled to take these substances. And then what John would do is he would have this guy with dreadlocks, who is a former drug user himself, go down to the pub with the people who had been to the interview earlier and ask them the same questions. And in the pub setting, people would not giving these sort of in the pub setting, people would give much more volitional explanations as to why they take drugs. Essentially, they said, I take drugs because I enjoy them. I think the thing here is as well that our whole legal system operates it encourages certain types of explanations. So imagine you're a junkie, you've hit a granny over the head, robbed a handbag, and then you're up in court and say, Your Honor, I really wanted to get high tonight, I love taking drugs, and that's why I hit the granny over the head and stole a handbag. You'd be locked up. You'd be sent to prison. However, if you say, Your Honor, I am terribly sorry, I am addicted, I had no choice in the matter, I needed to get high, you would get away with, going to treatment, for example. Another study that questions this notion of drugs overpowering us and making us addicted was done by Lee Robbins in the 1970s, who basically followed up Vietnam veterans who were, for all intents and purposes, addicted to substances while they were out in Vietnam being shot at. And what she found was that as people returned home to America, that only a very, very, very tiny minority continued to be addicted, and really challenged this notion that addiction is an irreversible disease. Most people just spontaneously recovered when they went back to America. And the next and final piece of evidence, body of evidence that speaks against this notion of addiction is that a lot of the sort of rationale for addiction and for the importance of pharmacology in explanations of addiction is derived from putting rats in so-called Skinner boxes. So what you do basically is you take a rat, put it in a box, and let it self-administer a drug, a hard drug. And what people found was that in such situations, rats would basically stop eating, stop drinking, and they'd just be pressing the lever to self-administer drugs. And people thought, well, there's evidence for the fact that, drugs have addictive properties and can overpower, rats. So pharmacology of drugs makes rats addicted. But then came along this Canadian guy called Bruce Alexander, who said, hang on a minute, let's do a little twist on this experiment. And what he had proposed was to house rats in so-called rat parks. So he put them in a big sort of rat park that was 200 times larger than the typical Skinner box. He housed rats socially, so both sexes, so they could do rat things and hang out and have sex. But they could also administer drugs. They could also administer drugs. And this is what it looked like. I get a distinct sense of underwhelmedness from you. You may think it doesn't look like much. Yes, okay, you might also think that the wallpaper alone might be enough to make those rats addicted if you're staring at that all day. However, you'd be making a mistake. You'd have to see it in context. This was done in the 1970s. To illustrate, this was hotel rooms in the 1970s. I'm reliably told that people didn't become more addicted when they stayed in hotels in the 1970s. Don't know what happened in the 60s, but it's a different matter. But what actually happened in those rat parks was that it was virtually impossible to get rats addicted. It basically interfered with their social functioning, with their hanging out, with their having sex. They just preferred not to take substances. So I think this is very strong evidence that the context or the housing is much more important than the substances themselves. And if you think about it, equivalent in human, if you're on a very poor sort of sink estates somewhere, if you're in that kind of context, you can see maybe why you would take drugs, more so than if you were in some paradise island. Other problems. Briefly, when people give up smoking, it's not the craving, it's not the withdrawal symptoms that are the strongest predictor of cessation. So while people stop smoking, their craving, their withdrawal symptoms, pass pretty quickly. And, in 3 or 4 weeks, within 3 or 4 weeks. But the urge to smoking persists, especially in social situations. So what I'm putting to you is that there must be other factors at play, rather than only being the nicotine that drives smoking. Similarly, medical treatment isn't always necessary. Most people quit without medical assistance. More than 80%, or close to 80% of people. Similarly, this is only recently people have started documenting this phenomenon of instantaneous quitting. And what this seems to be is that if you have a sudden change in motivation, you wake up one day and decide, I've had enough, I don't want to smoke anymore. That seems to be a much more effective way of giving up smoking than, continuously trying and, and planning it all out, I'm going to cut down. Waking up, quitting instantaneously seems to be the most effective way. Don't get me wrong, every single quit attempt is, quit attempts are likely to fail often initially, but the best predictor of successful quitting is the number of quit attempts made. Anyway, I think this, again, questions the idea that substances, or our addicted mindset cannot be overcome, and people fail to quit all the time. So, but then, most people who have smoked and then have given up smoking will have said during their smoking career at some point, I can't stop. And then successfully managed to stop. So I think it doesn't make philosophical sense to sort of praise the willpower of those, we previously see as helpless addicts, and then suddenly see them as like, wow, they've got amazing willpower. Were they addicted in the first place? It's like saying, maybe they were just a little bit addicted. But that's like saying you're a little bit pregnant. I mean, it doesn't make sense. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You're either addicted or you're not addicted. Similarly, smokers control a lot of control over their behavior. The smoke-free legislation came in, people changed their smoking habits. It wouldn't be possible to legislate against pneumonia, for example. I think it's something that happens to people Sorry, I think it's something people do, and it's not something that just happens to them, basically. So back to the sort of brain image. I think essentially pharmacology, brain scans can explain what happens to people's drugs, to people's brain or their body when people take drugs. They can't explain why people take drugs. Why is it that more young women are smoking now? Can't explain social class differences as a function of age, ethnicity. I think these are different levels of explanation. So consider this. Someone smokes a cigarette, there will be effects of nicotine on the brain. But there's also pharmacology of crossing the road in the rain to buy a packet of cigarettes. You will be able to demonstrate, you can scan someone's brain and you will be able to determine there's a pharmacology, there's a pattern of brain activity that corresponds to crossing the road. However, I don't think that just understanding the pharmacology allows for the conclusion that an act is compelled or non-volitional. Yeah, so I think this obsession with brain scanning and the likes, it's a bit like taking apart television to see where EastEnders comes from. I think it is an interesting question. How does a brain work? But I don't think it allows us to make inferences with regards to whether or not something is a compelled act or not. And I think there are consequences of viewing substance use as an addiction. So in the 1970s already, a guy at Sheffield University called Dick Iser basically showed that as people learn to smoke, literally as they learn to inhale the breath and get better, more proficient smokers, they will learn to explain their behavior in ways that absolves them from responsibility. People use the explanation of addiction to absolve themselves from any responsibility over their action, essentially. And the problem with this kind of explanation is that it makes quitting more difficult. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Within psychology, one of the biggest drivers, determinants of behavior change is this idea of self-efficacy. So, like, if you I always say to my students, self-efficacy, you can never go wrong because it is so important. And self-efficacy is people's understanding of, I can make a change, I can stop smoking, I can do this. It's people's perceived ability to accomplish behavior, to engage in a behavior, to accomplish behavior change. And I put it to you that, addiction directly undermines people's self-efficacy. I think it works for some people. I think, for example, Alcoholics Anonymous, or Narcotics Anonymous, it does work for some people. But I think, in general, the explanation of addiction comes at a cost, and the cost is that it divorces people from the roots of their own behavior. So to finish the first sort of part of this talk, I guess, is I think that this is the wrong message to be sending out. I think this is a self-handicapping message. We shouldn't be saying to people, smoking is drug use, whatever is highly addictive, you're going to get hooked on it. We should be saying to people, you're not exactly wise to start smoking or taking drugs or whatever, but if you choose to do so, you can stop at any time. People do so all the time. So I think a better way to think about addiction is to think of it as an interplay between what is called drug, set, and setting. And drug basically refers to the pharmacology of a substance. What effects does it have on a brain? The set refers to the sort of what is the psychology, what are the psychological motives that users bring to the substance use. And also the social context, the context in which substance use takes place. And we need to really explain all those three components to have a satisfactory understanding of what addiction is. And I have to tell you, I just think the social context, based on the studies I was presenting to you earlier, just happens to be the most important aspect. So I think substance use is an unhealthy choice that is mediated by physiological, pharmacological aspects, people's situations, individual factors, and social contexts, as are all choices. So from this perspective, the sort of work we've been doing over the years, this takes a very different view of addiction. We've accumulated, our work shows that drug use has a sense-giving script. It's derived from socially shared information, which both society at large have knowledge of the script that is addiction, and lay people, professionals. We all draw on this sort of narrative of drug use and addiction, I guess. Addiction can be part of the script, but it needn't be. If you ask people why they take drugs, they will give you meaningful answers. I smoke because I relax, or I take ecstasy because I like the feeling. And people also give personal reasons for stopping. And I think it's the reasons that help them stop. So the script is something that makes sense of substance use, gives it meaning, and provides a framework within which to decide to continue or to quit. And if you want to change your drug use behavior, your smoking behavior, you need to change the script. You don't just, slap on a nicotine patch and go, happy days, that's me, I finished smoking. It's more complicated than that. You have to literally reinvent yourself as clean. It's not just combating urges. You might have to walk differently, talk differently, hang out with other people. Change the way in which you view yourself and the substance. And there's evidence to suggest that addiction need not be part of the script. When people start smoking, young people, they give volitional reasons for doing so. And I think we need to keep it that way. Okay, finally, I'd like to give you some insights into the sort of work we're currently engaged in, and which I hope you will see follow on from the sort of first part of the talk. And that is, so we're interested in looking at how do social and environmental contexts shape such scripts of substance use. And the second research I'm just going to give you some examples from is how is it that groups regulate substance use behavior? And can we make use of groups to help bring about a more responsible way of, I guess, taking drugs? So this is the first work regarding how the social and environmental context shape script is currently been driven, I guess, by Rebecca, who's one of my PhD students and here tonight. And basically, previous work essentially works like this. You're in the US, because all this work is done in the United States, very little of it is done elsewhere, probably because NIDA has so much money. And give students questionnaires and lecture theatres, and you ask them essentially, why do you drink? You obviously call it alcohol expectancies or cognitions or something to make it sound more scientific. And then what you would do is you will find out what people are saying, self-reports, and will design interventions aimed at changing people's views of alcohol or other substances. I think the problem with this kind of approach is that it's got a little what we call ecological validity. And that is just basically a fancy way of saying that the materials and the settings of a study need to sort of bear some resemblance or reflect the real world. So what we've been doing is that we've been systematically manipulating the contexts in which people give answers, in which people talk about why it is they drink alcohol. And we're using different methodologies for this. So we'll do something called panoramic projection, where we basically create an immersive environment whereby we, project either a lecture theater scene or a pub scene onto an environment, and we can test people individually or in groups, and we can see how people's responses change in a very tightly controlled environment. Or we'll collect data in pub settings, in lecture theater context, and what we see is that actually most previous research fails to ignore this very the importance of social context. And I think our work really suggests that we need to start taking social context more seriously. And also, we now have a lot of arsenal at our disposal to do this. We can use smartphone apps. We can beep people in different contexts at different times of the day, and see and ask them, where are you and how do you feel about an issue. So I think as a discipline we really have to embrace this new technology. It has to be said, though, in terms of for career development, it is much easier and much better to just give students, undergraduate students, questionnaires and lecture theatres. I mean, you've got to think about it. We've all got mortgages to pay, we've got a family at home. It is just very easy to, you're teaching people anyway, so you might as well get them to complete a little study, which you'll then string to another study, but I think we need to move away from that. The second body of program of work, which has been driven by Jin, my other PhD student, is essentially concerned with how groups regulate substance use behaviors. And the theoretical background to this work is in social identity theory. And so this is the only theory of the night, so you need to go away from this knowing about social identity theory. And basically what social identity theory says is that we humans, we're social animals. We can't but help and be social. We derive meaning from interacting with other people. We derive a sense of our identity, a sense of ourselves from the people we hang out with. And we will then draw favorable, and the way in which this works psychologically is that people will compare their in-group favorably. We are cool, rule-breaking smokers to boring, straight out-group members. And that we do this for psychological reasons. Social identity theory says we do this to feel good about ourselves. So this is where this theory is coming work. And we know from previous work that substance use can be a social, it can be an appealing identity for some people. So for example, as I was saying, you might view yourself as a fun-loving rule breaker. And we also know that peer influences shape substance use. However, so far the literature, most of the literature essentially says that other people are bad for you. They will lead you astray in some way or the other, and make you drink more, smoke more, what have you. However, more recently, there's the literature is emerging that actually suggests that groups can also do good in some situations. So, and I think sometimes a theoretical development is best summed up by an example. So, and this is it. And this is a guy who worked at Liverpool University, and for his PhD, would you believe, went out to Euro 1998 and observed lots of football matches. And so one thing he was observing was he was on a campsite, and two Scottish fans assaulted a Tunisian player, basically, and beat him up. essentially. And what you need to know about Scottish football is the Scottish paradox. So whilst, within Scotland, football players, fans can be very sort of bigoted towards each other. You've got Celtic and Rangers, the old firm. But the paradox is that when Scottish football fans go abroad, they have this image of the fun-loving crowd, who get on with everyone. And so after this happened, the Scottish fans basically intervened and unceremoniously dragged those two protagonists who had beaten up the Tunisian guy away. And then being interviewed after, they basically said, we had to do something. I mean, otherwise we'd be left open to accusations of being, no better than the English. And that is obviously a fate worse than death in Scotland. But I think it illustrates to you that social identity, if you have a group identity and that is threatened, you might do something to intervene. And so this is my final study I want to talk to you about. It's just published, hot off the press. Is we sort of had a look at this idea of groups doing good in a qualitative and exploratory study with using focus groups. Conducted semi-structured interviews based on a good night out, and then what we did is we transcribed all those interviews, undertook a thematic analysis, and looked at incidences of alcohol-related violence people would come up with. And what we find is, I'll just let you read that. You find examples where the group escalates a situation. He's another good person for getting himself into scrapes, isn't he? You can't just stand back, you have to do something, intervene, you have to help out. So this is an example of the group escalating a situation. Another example of the kind of theme we came across is this idea of intergroup regulation. So what happened here is, I'll let you read it first. This is friends intervening to split parties up from fighting. We police it ourselves. That's the name of our paper as well. And finally, you get examples of non-intervention. But in this case, it's basically this guy, I've got an idiot, he's quite a small guy, he's got a chip in his shoulder, so we sometimes let him get beaten up. But this is an example of non-intervention, but it doesn't mean that the group isn't aware of what's going on. In fact, they are letting the guy get beaten up to teach him a lesson so that hopefully in future he won't be causing trouble. Friends like these, who needs enemies? Anyway, I think this is some preliminary evidence that groups regulate substance use, or regulate alcohol-fueled violence, and we're trying to now take this towards smoking and drinking to see whether we can harness the sort of power of groups. Groups might be part of the solution, and we should maybe stop thinking about substance use behaviors only in terms of individuals engaging in them. So my final overall conclusions for you is that it's difficult to stop consuming substances or for pharmacological, personal, and in particular social reasons. I think conceptualizing substance use in terms of addiction or dependence is a barrier that we should remove. We should stop perpetuating the dysfunctional story. I think people stop all the time. I think we need to move beyond individual pathology, encourage both individuals to take responsibility for their behavior, and we also need to encourage people to look out for their mates. Thank you.